Today we will learn and reflect on the struggles our country endured in the Civil War. When I started this channel, I thought that I would only focus on the human aspects of the Civil War, how the Civil War morphed from a war to preserve the Union to a war fought to emancipate the black man from slavery. But then I was astounded as I was looking for paintings to display in my videos, simply astounded by how numerous and epic the paintings of the battles of the Civil War were, and also paintings that expressed the pathos and yearnings of those who suffered through those long years of war fought on American soil. At the end of our talk, we will also discuss the American painter who painted several Civil War paintings, Winslow Homer, and we'll discuss the sources we use for this video in my blogs to cover this topic. You can also view those paintings in my PowerPoint script uploaded to SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments below. Let us learn and reflect together. The Civil War was perhaps the last great conflict celebrated by painters, because this struggle was the first great war memorialized by photographers, including Mathew Brady and others. Now, maybe American painters perhaps realized that this was the last time for them to record a visual history of a major war. And the Civil War was still in living memory when this famous mural of John Brown was painted in the Kansas State Capitol building. Congress had passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 that destroyed the Missouri Compromise by allowing for popular sovereignty, which meant that the voters could decide if Bleeding Kansas would be a slave state or a free state. Many Americans flocked to Kansas to vote with their guns. Open warfare broke out, and this was a mini Civil War before the beginning of the real American Civil War, and John Brown and his sons were in the thick of the battle. Later, John Brown would try to spark the real Civil War by raiding the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And this is near Washington, D.C., but it was put down by General Robert E. Lee of the U.S. Army. Black slaves did not rise in rebellion as he hoped, and after his trial, this painting shows him kissing a black child on his way to his execution. And this was an unthinkable act for a white man in Civil War times. Now, in reality, his wounds likely would have prevented him from walking. John Brown was seen as a martyr by many blacks, and the publicity surrounding his trial would indeed spark the real Civil War a few years later. Now, John Brown tried to involve his friend Frederick Douglass in the plot, but Douglass refused and tried to talk him out of it. And the artist Jacob Lawrence always likes to paint in dark tempera colors. As we discuss in a video in his autobiography, Frederick Douglass had to flee to England for several years to avoid being arrested since John Brown discussed this plot with him as a house guest. And the painting in this thumbnail depicts Frederick Douglass lobbying Lincoln to enlist emancipated blacks as Union Army soldiers. Immediately after President Lincoln was elected in November 1860, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union the month after his inauguration. The state demanded that the federal government abandon Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and they refused to allow the federal government to resupply the fort with food and water. In the first painting, we see the religious fervor that gripped many soldiers on both sides as they pray as Major Anderson raises the Union flag. Lincoln was inaugurated in March 1861, and South Carolina bombarded Fort Sumter in April 1861, and although the Union forces returned fire, they were forced to evacuate the fort. And the final painting shows the desolation wrought by the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Now that the South has fired the opening salvo of the Civil War, Lincoln calls up 75,000 volunteers to quell the rebellion, and 4 more states secede from the Union. General Winfield Scott, the strategic general and hero of the Mexican War, he had served under 7 presidents, but in the 1860s he was in his 70s, and he was so obese that he had to be hoisted by a crane on and off his horse. But Scott was still a sharp general, and his Anaconda plan was the strategy that would win the war. And this great snake picture was printed in newspapers across the country in 1861. The steps of this plan first called for a naval blockade that strangled the commerce of the Confederacy, with the Union forces seizing control of the Mississippi River, and then the Union forces marching through the heart of the Confederacy. General Scott predicted that 300,000 soldiers would be needed to defeat the Confederacy, which was less than half of the size of the eventual Union Army, but it was shocking numbers at the beginning of the war, when the Union Army had fewer than 20,000 soldiers. And of course the Confederacy had to build their army from scratch. After Virginia seceded, the Confederacy quickly moved its capital to Richmond, Virginia, which was about 100 miles from Washington, D.C. The Confederates compared their rebellion to the American Revolution, and to be honest, the Americans in the Revolution may have faced longer odds than the Confederacy in the Civil War, except that in the Revolutionary War the enemy's capital was in London, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, to win the war, the Union Army would be compelled to invade the Confederacy. The popular Northern political opinion was that if the Union Army simply captured Richmond, the Confederate capital, the war would quickly be over, which militarily was just not true. After all, in the Revolutionary War, the British captured both Philadelphia and New York City, but still lost the war. Lincoln faced tremendous political pressure to invade the South immediately, but the generals advised against quick military action. They wanted to wait until the conscripted troops had been trained and drilled. Now, Lincoln pointed out that the Confederate troops were just as green, and in July 1861 the first battle of the Civil War was fought, the First Battle of Bull Run, known to the Confederacy as the Battle of First Manassas. The battle could have gone either way, but the Confederates prevailed late in the day and forced the Union forces, since they were green Union forces, into a panicked retreat back to Washington, D.C. And there the panicked fleeing forces got tangled up with crowds of civilians who were there picnicking in the fields in northern Virginia, who wanted to get the first news of the Union victory. And in the melee, the pursuing Confederate forces captured a U.S. congressman. And this was the first battle in the first modern war, and the number of casualties shocked the citizenry at both sides. The Union suffered 2,700 casualties, and the Confederates 2,000 casualties. Although these would be light numbers for a Civil War battle, they were by far the largest number of casualties suffered by any army in any battle fought in North America. General Winfield Scott retired, and George McClellan replaced him as the head of the Union Army. And our main source, Professor Gallagher of the Teaching Company, says this: General McClellan was a master organizer, and by the end of September 1861, he'd built the Army of the Potomac into a formidable force of more than 100,000 well-equipped and well-trained men. He motivated his men and made them feel like soldiers. For this, he was the best-loved Union commander in the war, inspiring his men with the kind of devotion that the Army of Northern Virginia gave to Robert E. Lee. But George McClellan was not quick to move the soldiers into battle. And what were the early trends of the Civil War? First, many Union generals were Democrats, and they were not favorable to emancipation. And I want to remind you that there were many Confederate sympathizers in northern states, just as there were many Union men in the Confederate states, which means that we always want to remember history in clearer terms than it actually was lived. And compared to prior wars, rifles and artillery were faster loading, faster firing, more accurate, and there were repeating rifles and Gatling guns, which caused many of the increased casualties. And in the Civil War, in both sides, flank attacks were favored over frontal assaults because in modern wars such as this, frontal assaults meant massive casualties. Communications and medicine were primitive, and generals needed to be close to the battle. But battles were so bloody that generals often lost their nerve, especially George McClellan. And this was true on both sides. And this was the first war to use railroads to move armies. However, like in earlier times, there rarely were winter campaigns in the Civil War. And the public press and diplomatic corps judged who was winning the war solely by the progress in the Eastern Theater rather than the more strategic Western Theater. Ulysses S. Grant enlisted as an officer and served initially in the Western Army, fighting the Confederates in Tennessee and on the Mississippi and Missouri River systems. The Union had a strategic advantage in the Western Theater, and Grant was a persistent and methodical campaigner from early in the war. And Grant and the other Union generals won a series of battles that brought Tennessee back into the Union and flushed the Confederates out of Missouri. Grant's forces first captured the river Fort Henry, and then the river Fort Donelson in February 1862, and that was the beginning of the campaign to control the Mississippi River. But in April 1862, large Confederate forces surprised and attacked Major General Grant and the Union forces at Shiloh. Scholars say that he should have been more cautious, and on the first day the Union flanks were forced back. But the Union center position, which was nicknamed the Hornet's Nest, held fast, and Grant kept his cool and his resolve stabilized the Union front. And on the next day the Union forces in turn forced the Confederates to retreat. And this was the last time the Confederacy would seriously challenge the Union positions in Tennessee. You can see from the painting much of the fighting was in the woods. The casualties again shocked the nation. 13,000 Union casualties and 11,000 Confederate casualties. The casualties at this one battle far exceeded the total American and colonial casualties in all wars combined up to that moment. And we see in the description here that some Union regiments fled in panic as Major General U.S. Grant ordered his division commanders to hold at all costs. And on the Eastern Front, Lincoln was constantly hounding McClellan to move against the Confederate forces. Finally, McClellan moved his forces to the Peninsula between the James and York Rivers in Virginia, which points straight at Richmond, and moving slowly because McClellan was always overcautious. The Confederate forces harassed McClellan's forces and also attacked in the Shenandoah Valley some distance away to distract the Union forces. But the Confederate General Joseph Johnston attempted a poorly executed frontal assault on McClellan's slow-moving forces in May 1862. Professor Gallagher states, "The battle ended as a tactical draw but had long-term consequences. McClellan was upset by the scale of the carnage and became even more timid. And the Confederate General Johnston was wounded during the battle and was replaced by Robert E. Lee." So Robert E. Lee was not a general from the beginning of the war. Now, General Robert E. Lee now reorganized the Confederate forces so they could be a more effective fighting army. There were 5 engagements, and the last was the battle on Malvern Hill in July 1862. McClellan occupied an easily defensible hill, and the Confederate frontal assaults led to massive casualties, as our painting depicts. But McClellan did not counterattack. And these 7 battles in the Eastern Theater saw the blood flow, with 20,000 Confederate casualties and 16,000 Union casualties. But the strategic initiative passed to the more aggressive Robert E. Lee, and the European diplomats now thought that the South was winning the war. So Confederate morale rebounded after many reversals up to that date. President Lincoln complained how everyone ignored the many Union victories in the West, while they exaggerated the half-defeat of the 7 days' battles. But, in the long run, the Confederacy was not in a favorable strategic position. Lincoln was having general problems. He had already demoted McClellan from overall commander to commander of the Army of the Potomac, but then after the lost opportunities of the Peninsula and 7 days campaigns, he was replaced by General John Pope, who talked a good game about bringing a harsher war to the Virginia rebels. But the armies of Lee and Jackson totally outmaneuvered him as he was defeated at the Battle of Second Manassas in August 1862, with massive casualties. And this time the Union forces suffered 16,000 casualties to the Confederate casualties of 9,000. Pope was relieved of command and sent to fight the Sioux Indians in Minnesota, as far away from the Civil War as possible, and Lincoln was forced to reinstate McClellan as commander, as he had no other choice. There was no one else to step in. Meanwhile, midterm elections were approaching. Robert E. Lee retained the strategic initiative by moving his army across the Potomac into western Maryland. He hoped to get fodder and provisions and ease up on the farmers in Virginia. He had this vision that all these Marylanders would somehow join his army, but most of the Confederate sympathizers were in eastern Maryland. And his army had a bit of a ragtag appearance, and his soldiers were tired from the constant campaigning. And, fortunately for the Union, a copy of his battle orders fell into McClellan's hands. But McClellan was too timid to win a resounding victory, even with Lee's battle plans in his hands. But the Battle of Antietam counted as a Union victory, with heavy casualties on both sides. The Union casualties were 12,000, the Confederate 10,000. But Lee was able to escape across the Potomac from Maryland. Lincoln removed McClellan from command for good the day after the midterm elections. And England and France decided to wait and see before committing to helping the Confederates. And a dubious distinction of the Battle of Antietam is that this was the first time an American battlefield had ever been photographed before the dead had been buried. And Lincoln had a secret plan of sorts in his pocket, waiting to be revealed when there was a Union victory. And this was the Emancipation Proclamation, which was revealed after the Union victory at Antietam. And this is a rare photograph picturing Lincoln and his generals, including McClellan, at Antietam. The Emancipation Proclamation did not emancipate any slaves immediately. Lincoln could only free the slaves still under Confederate control as commander-in-chief. Now, this was not unusual. The British also offered freedom to deserting slaves in the Revolutionary War. But now, every time Union forces moved south, slaves would flock to the Union lines seeking their freedom, assisting with the war effort, and eventually also becoming Union soldiers. This illustration from Harper's Weekly showed what emancipation meant to runaway black slaves, and that is freedom from the whip, freedom from abuse, freedom to become educated, freedom to learn how to read the Bible, freedom to vote, freedom to have a real job, and most of all, freedom to marry, freedom to own a house, and freedom to raise a family that would never be broken up at the slave auction. And this is a photograph of contrabands who fled to the Union lines to become cooks and laundresses and laborers and teamsters and railroad repair crews early in the war. And this idyllic painting of Union soldiers accepting a drink by Eastman Johnson during a lull in the fighting tells many stories. The ex-slave mother is quite comfortable giving these soldiers a drink on her doorstep, as she is now free. But the mother is not so comfortable that she allows these soldiers into her house. And her daughter is also not so scared that she hides, but she does stand off at a little bit of a distance. And on plantations, white men were free to have their way with whatever pretty black girls as they wished, since, like livestock, they were merely property. So how did warfare evolve at this point in the Civil War? And rifle cannons made forts obsolete. Civil War was now a total war waged against the whole society, although not directly targeting civilian lives. The armies did target civilian property. More black soldiers enlisted in the Union Army, and freed slaves provided the Union Army with valuable intelligence in the Deep South. And there were longer enlistment periods, and those Confederate soldiers who signed up for a short enlistment period wound up forced to serve out the whole war. And as the Civil War progressed, there was an evolution of trench warfare, and that's a precursor to World War I. Every time the armies stopped, they immediately started digging defensive trenches to shield them from the gunfire. And there was no POW exchanges between the two armies, because the South wanted to enslave rather than exchange captured black soldiers. And we have a picture here of my daughter and I visiting Fort Pulaski. That was the fort that was threatened by the rifle cannon. Union forces were across the channel several miles away. The barrels of the rifle cannons were grooved just like the grooved barrels of a gun. And these cannon fired off large bullet-like projectiles that were grooved like smaller bullets are, and they kept aiming and they got closer and closer and closer to where the ammunition was stored in the fort. And they got so close that the Confederates literally gave up without losing a single person in the battle. And there was also in Savannah another Fort McAllister that's an earthen fort along the Savannah River. Now, Lincoln was eager for more victories on the battlefield, but once again he was frustrated. General Burnside was defeated with 12,000 casualties in the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia, after full frontal assaults on the Confederate line. And Lincoln replaced him with General Hooker. And despite outnumbering the Confederates 2-1, he was humiliated and defeated at the Battle of Chancellorsville, also in Virginia in May 1863. Now, Hooker may have been a decent general, but Robert E. Lee was a brilliant general. But during this battle, the famous one-armed Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was shot and killed. And Lee famously said, "Jackson had lost his left arm, but now I have lost my right arm." Now, the Unions had captured New Orleans and it had captured many of the forts in the upper Mississippi River system. But in the May of 1863, Grant had been fighting for 5 months to capture the key Confederate port of Vicksburg, Mississippi. As you can see in this lithograph, against the advice of most of his staff, Grant took a risk, and Federal gunboats and troop transports successfully ran past the powerful Confederate batteries, with only one Union gunboat sunk to meet up with Grant, who protected his flank by marching inland, capturing Jackson, the capital of Mississippi. After failing to capture Vicksburg, he put it under a 6-week bombardment and siege, and civilians were reduced to living in caves dug out of the riverbank and eating pets and vermin to stay alive. We also have the Union forces that broke the siege of Vicksburg. Now, Professor Gallagher says this: Grant's Vicksburg campaign ranks among the most brilliant in American history. He abandoned his supply lines and moving east towards Jackson, his army living off the land, capturing food and livestock from the farms they encountered. He marched quickly and defeated the enemy in detail, not giving the Confederates time to consolidate their forces, capturing a 30,000-man army and vast Confederate military material. His victory achieved one of the North's major strategic goals. And we have another painting of the Battle of Chickamauga in Georgia near Tennessee. This was a Confederate victory after their defeat at Vicksburg, but with heavy casualties again, 16,000 for the Union and 18,500 for the Confederacy. And this was the second highest casualties after Gettysburg. But soon after the defeat at Chickamauga, Grant took charge and won the Battle of Chattanooga, with casualties of about 6,000 on each side. And we have another painting about the soldier's dream of home, showing a Union soldier sleeping in a military camp with a letter home by his side and dreaming of being happily reunited by his family. The Union held many forts on the coast in the South throughout the war and methodically captured more forts as the war drug on. One excellent example is Fort Clinch in Fernandina Beach, which the Confederates abandoned. And this is an excellent fort to visit near the Florida-Georgia border off I-95. And this again is my daughter. She's a little bit older in this picture. And we also have the Union Fort in the Dry Tortugas Key, which is off of Key West. It's in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. It's a key federal fort. The fort literally circles the island. And the Union were assured by the engineers that there was bedrock down there. So they kept building and building this fort on the sand. And when they started building the third floor, the fort started to sink. And so they decided that they'd better not complete the third story. But the cisterns had been broken. But anyway, this was a key federal fort for many years. And we also have Fort Zachary Taylor in Key West, Florida, right near the cruise ships. In this lithograph, we have New Orleans captured by Currier and Ives. This was shortly before Vicksburg. The Union now controlled New Orleans, the largest city and largest port, Nashville with major industries, Memphis, which was a major port, and Corinth, which was a major rail center. The armor-plated ironclad warships were used for the first time in the Civil War, where they played a major role. The Union built around 50 ironclads, and the Confederates had fewer since many countries refused to manufacture war items for the Confederacy. Like all new technology, they had technical problems, but they delivered tremendous firepower to the enemy and were relatively impervious to bullets, but they were not immune to mines. And we can see in the painting the battle scene between the ironclads USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, which was built on the hull of the Merrimac. Although the Union victory at Vicksburg was strategically the turning point of the war, the newspaper-reading public and the European diplomats in the East deprecated these victories in the far-off theater of the war. Lincoln once again replaced his top general, Hooker, with General Meade, and he would face Robert E. Lee, who decided again to invade the North, fighting the famous Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania in July 1863. This was the bloodiest battle of the war. On the last day of the battle, the Confederates were massacred in a frontal assault in Pickett's charge. Nearly a third of the soldiers fighting were wounded or died on the battlefield, 28% for the Union, or 23,000 men, or 37% for the Army of North Virginia, or 28,000 men. This was a Union victory, but like McClellan, General Meade and his army were too exhausted to follow the Confederate army to finish it off. Especially since this was a war of attrition, this was a major military, political, and public relations defeat for the Confederacy. Now, certainly no European country would recognize the Confederacy as a nation. Another minor battle, which was a Union defeat, was important because it showed the valor with which the colored regiments displayed when they attempted to storm Fort Wagner at the approach to Charleston Harbor. President Lincoln appointed the best fighting general he had, and that was General Grant, to command all the armies of the Potomac. And he was the first general since Washington to be appointed lieutenant general. Lincoln was looking for a knockout blow to finally defeat the Confederacy. And Grant was planning a war of exhaustion. The Union armies would live off the land whenever possible, consuming or destroying the food and supplies needed to sustain the Confederate armies. It is fitting that this painting depicts General Grant and his generals on horseback, as Grant was an excellent handler of horses. Now, Grant and Lincoln's threefold strategy to end the Civil War was simple. General Grant would face off Robert E. Lee in Virginia, and General Sherman would march from Chattanooga to Atlanta and then to the sea at Savannah, Georgia. And General Banks would strike from Louisiana against Mobile, Alabama, and this effort would be hopelessly bogged down due to his inaction and did not play a major part in the war. And we have a painting of the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee. And this was a major defeat for the Confederacy and ended the Confederate threat to Tennessee. General Sherman's defeat of the Confederate forces in Atlanta and his subsequent march to the sea to Savannah and then north to the Carolinas did not yield too many paintings. And after the Battle of Atlanta, few large battles were fought, but it was devastating to the Confederacy as he destroyed much of the valuable cropland and livestock and railroads of the Confederacy. The flames of the burning of Atlanta was a backdrop for the movie Gone with the Wind. And in this lithograph we see the destruction of Sherman's march to the sea. General Grant's goal was to continually pound the Confederacy, battle after battle, week after week, month after month, totally exhausting both armies, but exhausting the ill-supplied Confederate forces more. We see in this Winslow Homer painting the skirmish of the Wilderness, which could have been from the battle in the Wilderness, where both armies blindly shot at each other, literally mowing down the forest with their bullets and cannon during the battle. Both armies together suffered about 2,500 casualties a day from May 5th through June 18th, and that was the equivalent of a first Manassas every single day. Grant and Lincoln were hoping for a decisive victory, but Robert E. Lee was too good a general for that, so Grant continually flanked Lee's forces, and he did not make any major mistakes that Lee could take advantage of. Some northern newspapermen called Grant a butcher, but Lincoln liked his decisiveness and his willingness to fight, as this was what was needed to end the war. And the Battle of Spotsylvania was one of the battles of this period. And General Sheridan's diversionary campaign in the Shenandoah Valley raised Northern morale, which was low from the large casualties suffered by the Union armies. The Battle of Petersburg in the closing days of the war resulted in Robert E. Lee's retreat from the capital of the Confederacy, which was Richmond, Virginia. The Confederate government fled south before the Union forces captured Richmond, and days later Lincoln would sit in Jefferson Davis's chair in Richmond. Robert E. Lee was considering continuing a guerrilla war, but with his army dwindling in size, he was outflanked and the Union Army cut off the Confederates from his supplies. And also at this time we have the Waterloo of the Confederacy, the Battle of Five Forks, fought in April 1865. This is showing a charge led by the Union general Philip Sheridan. When the Confederates retreated from Richmond, they set fire to the military supplies, fires which spread throughout Richmond. Also, this lithograph is Moving Day in Richmond, Virginia. Confederate leaders here are caricatured as being evicted from a rundown house. General Robert E. Lee is loading swords and guns in a cart hitched to scrawny dogs, and Jefferson Davis hauls boxes labeled with names of Confederate states. And the load is falling apart off his back. Onlookers include a barefoot child, a man with one arm, and an African American thumbing his nose as a taunt. And this is a picture of Abraham Lincoln entering Richmond, where he would sit in Jefferson Davis' seat. At the instruction of Abraham Lincoln, General Grant offered generous terms when they met at Appomattox Courthouse in early April 1865. The defeated Confederates would not be prisoners of war, and Grant provided rations for Lee's troops, but not fodder for his horses. All that was required of the Confederate soldiers was to stack their arms, parole out of the army, and they were allowed to return home with their horses. Not much is made how Robert E. Lee came in nobly pressed in military regalia while General Grant came in a dirty, crumpled uniform, but Grant simply did not want to keep Lee waiting. They first exchanged small talk, as they had served together in the Mexican War, but Lee could not recall ever meeting Grant. Robert E. Lee offered his sword to Grant as he was the defeated general, but Grant refused it, perhaps thinking that this was a bloody conflict over a corrupt institution, slavery, and not at all a chivalrous war. And these paintings all show Robert E. Lee with his sword. And all these paintings show the many Union generals and officers wanting to see the famous General Robert E. Lee. This false sense of chivalry can also be seen in the movie poster for Birth of a Nation, where the KKK Night Riders were depicted as chivalrous knights defending Southern womanhood. This was the popular movie that was endorsed by President Wilson that led to the resurgence of the KKK. Amazingly, we also have stained glass windows of Confederate Generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson in the Washington National Cathedral. Over the next few months, the other armies of the Confederacy surrendered, and sadly, a few weeks after Appomattox, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Booth broke his left leg leaping onto the stage and was captured a short while later. President Andrew Johnson from Tennessee was sworn in as president and showed himself to be a Southern sympathizer. hindering the civil rights legislation passed after the end of the Civil War. You can see in this painting of the viewing of the body of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson is sitting at a distance, not talking to the other men in the room, like he's somewhat ostracized. Another famous painting, Henry Mosler completed his best-known painting, The Lost Cause, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. And we have in the Lost Cause painting a lithograph from Currier and Ives' home on the Mississippi. We already saw one painting by Winslow Homer. He was a commercial illustrator in his early years. He loved to paint sailboats at seas and also canoes on small rivers. Harper's Weekly sent him to the home front during the Civil War. His painting of Home Sweet Home really kick-started his career as a painter. His choice of colors and clouds really set the mood for his paintings. His illustration for Harper's shows how precariously perched the Union sharpshooter is. His painting of prisoners at the front show guns on the ground that are within reach of the prisoners, who are not restrained and who do not reach for the weapons. Perhaps these soldiers are tired of fighting. Perhaps they know they would be better fed as Northern POWs than as Confederate soldiers. Winslow Homer's Rainy Day in Camp was about camp life during the Civil War, although it was painted many years later. Now the forlorn mule is symbolic of the rundown Confederacy. But why the teepees? Perhaps there were some Indian soldiers in this company. Winslow Homer paints the visit from the old mistress to her slaves in dark, damp, dreary, depressing colors. The old mistress looks awkward. Maybe she's not used to treating her former slaves as equals, and her former slaves don't appear to be thrilled to see her. After the war, both Winslow Homer and the nation favored happy pictures of women and children in sunlight, and his watercolors have such bright colors. As he aged, his paintings matured. The Adirondack Guide has astounding colors. Here he successfully captures the pioneer spirit. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. And our main source was the lectures by Gary Gallagher on the American Civil War. There's 48 lectures in all. And in addition to many of the battles that we covered, he also has a lot of topics on the Civil War itself, like life at the home front on both sides, the opponent talking about the opposing sides, talking about the role of slaves in the war, and talking about the role of freed slaves in the war, and wartime reconstruction, and life at the home front for both the Union and the Confederacy. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.